Today we've got 10 revision tricks to keep your poetry from fossilizing too quickly. I've said it before, and I'll probably say it again. When we think of writing, we often just think of the first, shortest, and least interesting part of the writing process, drafting. Writers sit down with a notebook and pen or a blank screen and keyboard and then put brilliant thoughts down one letter at a time, and that's what we think of as writing. Except it isn't. Spend much time in the company of people who are even half serious about writing, and you'll quickly realize that there's so much more to the process than just putting down words the first time. Sure, drafting is fun, but I think 90% of the real work and real fun of writing is in the revision stage. And in common usage, revision is just a process of taking a draft and making it better by changing it in some way. You could say that revising is, for a lot of people, synonymous with fixing or improving. And that's not wrong. That is the goal of revision, to end up with something better. But it's also not really in line with the word's roots. Of course, you'll recognize the word vision, which is the thing that eyes do, and the prefix re means again. So yeah, the desired outcome for revision is improvement, but the actual process of revision is one of seeing your work with new eyes, gaining a new perspective on it that awakens you to the possibilities and steels you for the exciting work of making necessary, even if radical, changes. But gaining that flexibility and perspective can be difficult. After all, you're the person who wrote the thing, and you are still who you are. What perspective can you have but your own? Well, lucky for all of us, there are some writerly tricks you can play on yourself to see your work with new eyes, literally to revise your work, looking ahead to its full potential. If you've ever worked with a dough, like making bread or pizza or something like that, you'll know that dough can tighten up and refuse manipulation if you work it too much. All that gluten gets fussy and the whole mass recoils into a surly lump, no matter how insistently you try to roll it out. At times like those, the only course of action really is to leave it alone to rest for a while. Once the dough has had a minute to let its guard down, that's when you strike and roll out a smooth disc of pizza crust. And poems can behave in much the same way. Tinker too much all at once, and you and your poem will twist yourselves into a tight, glutinous knot of intractable literary misery. When that happens, or better yet, before that happens, the best thing to do is just walk away. Write your poem and then put it in a drawer or some folder far away from your desktop and just let it sit. But don't think about it either. Take a walk, build a birdhouse, glaze your wheelbarrow with rainwater, do anything else for as long as you reasonably can. Take your wheel of fresh poetic cheddar and roll it into your finest cave and let it wait. Let it age. Let it do its thing while you do yours. The idea is that leaving a poem alone lets you gain a kind of critical distance. It's easy to critique someone else's poem, and relatively harder to critique your own. But it's also much easier to critique a poem you wrote last month than one you wrote before lunch. If I may heap another metaphor into this segment, it's like the old proverb that you can't cross the same river twice, because the second time around, it's not the same river and you're not the same person. Leave a poem alone for a while, and you can't help but come back to it with fresh eyes. Now you've forgotten the labor of committing that first draft to paper, and you're in a better spot to recognize your nonsense and sift out the highlights. Now you're not critiquing a poem you wrote, you're critiquing a poem some goofball version of you from 6 years ago wrote, and in that case, there's really no need for emotional turmoil. When it comes to revision, leaving a poem alone for a while is my first and best strategy. So if you're going to start somewhere, I'd recommend starting here. Sometimes you don't have 2 months to ignore a poem, either because you have an assignment due, some other kind of submission deadline, or you're just not the type to let go of a poem and perfect your apple pie recipe while it's waiting. In that case, you could try writing from memory. That is, write your poem on a sheet of paper or its digital equivalent, and then flip the paper over or close the window. Put it completely out of sight. Maybe get up for a drink of water to distract your short-term memory for a second, and then come back and do your best to write your poem again from memory. Now, the goal here is not to test your ability to recall tiny details. The goal is to let your own fallible memory filter out the drab, dull, and forgettable lines in your original poem. Odds are that the things that end up in the from memory version will be the livelier, more unexpected, and more memorable parts. The things that lingered in your mind will probably be the things that will linger in a reader's mind. If you want to leave a lasting impression, why not let your own lasting impressions of the piece guide the way? When you're staring at a draft in progress, the physical presence of all those words and letters can overcomplicate your decision-making. So set it all aside and focus instead on what are literally the most memorable parts of your poem. One great way to get a new perspective on a poem is to just change its size radically. It's not the same poem if it's way shorter or longer than the one you started out with. I've probably mentioned it before, but I find that most of my poems shrink by about half during the revision process. Where poetry aims to be a concentrated dose of language and image, a shorter version of a poem will tend to be a better version. There's just a lot of extra stuff that comes out in a first draft that you probably don't need in the final version. So go through and look for those places where you can drop a stanza or two without really harming the overall experience. Maybe find a place where you could use a single word instead of a whole phrase. Or arbitrarily tell yourself that you have to discard 2/3 of your poem. What absolutely has to stay then? What can you afford to lose? Putting yourself in an arbitrary verbal economy bind can be a great way to see what's at the heart of your poem. Your final version might not be as short as the one you force yourself to write during revision, but again, the way you approach the piece when you look at it through the eyes of radical cuts can tell you something about the piece you're actually writing. But don't get too attached to that smallness. Poetry is a minute art, and it can sometimes feel like looking at the world through a microscope. And that's great. You can see some really fascinating things through a microscope. But how do you know you aren't microscoping the less interesting part of your subject if you never zoom out? The best part of your poem could be just out of frame. In that case, what happens to your poem if you decide to write a version of it that is twice as long as the original draft? What new details or discoveries are there to make when you take in the whole scene and not just the tiny scrap that initially inspired you? One of the reasons that my early drafts tend to be so much longer than the final version, beyond the fact that there's just some natural hemming and hawing during drafting, is that I don't quite know what the poem is yet. So the strategy is to write expansively, to cast a wide net in order to ensure that the actual poem is in there somewhere. Take it all in, put it all on the page, see what's there, and then decide what you're zooming in on. Cuts are probably inevitable, but cutting is so much less painful when you write too much on purpose, and when you know you're refining your focus on the most meaningful heart of the piece. Another reason that early drafts might be pretty long is that writing is a form of inquiry. You write in order to figure out what you have to say. So much of the first draft of a poem may not be the poem, but the writing you need to do to discover the poem. Often, writers will start writing and stop, not when the poem is finished, but when the poem is first discovered. It's common to find drafts of poems and even research papers that get exciting right as they end. It's a sure sign that the writer was finally satisfied that they had found their purpose, but mistook it for the end of the process rather than the beginning. Driven by a different motive, but ending in the same place, some writers become infatuated with an idea and then think that everyone would have a better time if that good idea were somehow revealed dramatically right at the end, ideally with some kind of contrived twist. But poems written with a surprise ending in mind usually end up being weighed down with a great deal of dull matter on the front end, only to end with something that isn't quite as thrilling as the writer had imagined it would be. These are the poems Robert Frost calls trick poems or no poems at all. In either case, though, the answer is the same. Throw away everything but the last line and start your poem there. The end of your discovery writing is very likely the beginning of the actual poem. Everything before that did serve a purpose for you, but it doesn't really serve a purpose for your readers. Thank it for its service, let it all go into the void, and then see where the last line takes you. All those dirty bowls and spoons in the kitchen played their part. They helped you to prepare your very special linguine, but you wouldn't force your guests to eat in a dirty kitchen. Spare your readers the preparation, and serve them the dish you ended up with on a clean plate in a lovely dining room. They only want the poem, not the journaling you did to figure out the poem. So how does your concept of the poem change when you start out where you originally finished up? Figurative language is baked into the poetic tradition. Poems have metaphors, sometimes poems are metaphors, but at other times, though, poems are very literal and specific descriptions of a moment. Your draft will probably fall somewhere on that spectrum, and you can get yourself into a revisionary viewing position by moving the slider on figurative language for your poem. What would happen, for example, if you took all the stuff that your poem is about, the tall grass, the little creek, the swaying trees near your childhood home, and restricted it only to the title, And what if then the rest of the poem had to be about something totally different, but metaphorically related to your childhood afternoons by the creek? What if you couldn't write what you planned to write, but had to write something else that shed metaphorical light on your original idea? Perhaps to evoke that sense of freedom and exploration that going to the creek gave you as a child, you write a poem about a dog running at full speed in a fenced-in backyard, expressing freedom while at the same time in a contained, managed space. That may not be what your poem ends up being, but it will certainly give you a new perspective on the whole thing that you'd never have if you stuck with your original approach. Or, on the other hand, maybe you're writing a poem and trying to build out a complex metaphor about how seashells and carnations at a school event made you think about the passage of time and the brevity of life. What if you weren't allowed to lean on that metaphor, and you just had to dwell in the literal moment, scattered shells and half-bloomed flowers on a table you shared with colleagues and students? By stripping out the metaphor, you may recognize weaknesses in your imagery that you overlooked while you were doing the abstract metaphorical work of the initial draft. By enforcing metaphor where you didn't have it before, you may recognize meaningful resonances that you could have overlooked while focusing so intently on the moment itself. Whatever you do, though, you're sure to come away with a whole new vision of the poem in question. I think one of the biggest favors writers can do for themselves is to read their own work out loud to themselves. There's not a piece of writing in the last several years that I've submitted, published, or presented without reading it out loud to myself. It's such an undervalued hack for getting more out of your writing. The key here is that you're recruiting different senses to process your work. When you read silently, you're using vision. When you read out loud, you're recruiting your lungs, your mouth, your ears. It's an entirely different sensory experience, and those other senses are attuned to language and thought in different ways. You will notice things when you read out loud that you won't notice when you read silently. More than that, and this is especially important with poetry, you'll develop an embodied sense of the rhythm, sounds, and feel of language. Before anything else, language is an embodied thing, and you're missing out on a lot if you treat it as a purely intellectual transaction mediated by the page and retina. I don't want to overpromise, but recruiting your embodied senses to process your own work could do a lot to transform your writing practice overall, to say nothing of the effect it could have on a single piece. Get a feel for language, and you'll write better poetry. And you're not going to get a feel for language if you take the advice of the speed reading coaches. What's the rush? Linger in language, savor its sounds, relish its rhythms, cultivate your own cadence. None of that's happening if you're counting words per minute. But beyond reading your work out loud, just verbalizing it in any way, even explaining it to someone, can make all kinds of difference. When a student comes to my office with a draft of a poem and a look of defeat, the first thing I do is ask them what they're going for. What are they trying to say? Without fail, they tell me something exciting and compelling and wonderful that's nowhere to be found on the page. They've got the poem in their heads, but they just haven't written it yet. Sometimes you can get all tangled up in trying to write something that you manage not to write it at all. For a lot of people, it can be easier to process and express ideas by saying them. So say what you want to write about. Explain what you're trying to do with the poem, and then let that explanation lead you through the process of writing it. We generally get good at speaking long before we get good at writing, so take advantage of that more deeply rooted connection to language to give you a new perspective on your own work of linguistic art. Or, as long as you're saying words out loud, what would happen if you required yourself to write your poem with a whole new lexical repertoire? What if that poem about a fishing trip with your grandfather has to unfold without words like fish, rowboat, reel, and grandfather? Obviously, you're going to have to adopt a new perspective on the poem if you're going this route. If we take friend of the show Kenneth Burke's argument about terministic screens seriously, forcing yourself to write with all new words will shape your perception of the poem in significant and new ways. Not only that, but it will put you in a position to find words, phrases, and images that are beyond the ones that are closest to hand. You'll find your way to more novel and interesting writing if you banish all the words you're used to using in this instance. Of course, we're not talking about the grammatical words like determiners and prepositions. There's no avoiding those, but it's the content words, nouns, verbs, and modifiers that you could be doing so much more with. So give it a try and see what happens. While you're writing your poem in all new words, you might as well try putting it into an all new form. The shape of a poem can make all the difference for how you experience it. So gain a new perspective by putting it in a different shape. For poets who are trying out received forms like the sonnet or the villanelle, first drafts can look like reasonably competent exercises in meter and rhyme that also lack all the spark of real poetry. Worse still, you might find yourself practicing your best 19th century style mangling of syntax in order to get those rhyming words to march in order at the ends of lines. In cases like those, releasing the strictures of form for a while can help you to find what's really going on in that poem, to really clarify its lyrical gesture without all the distractions of the rules. Try it in free verse for a while, or more radically, as a prose poem. Take out all the line breaks and make sure you're saying something interesting before you worry about how it looks on the page. And of course, the inverse is true. Maybe you're writing prose poetry, how very modern, but writing a version in verse could help slack prose stand a little straighter. If you find your prose poetry reading more like the pre-ingredient ramble on a food blog, the pressures of form might just be what you need to tighten and focus your poem for when you return it to prose. But of course, you can also play with your own created forms. What happens if you write your poem so that it splits its time between the left and right margins of the page? What if you put blank space between words in a line? What if you write it in couplets or in a single long stanza? What does the poem look like when you turn it sideways? Shape matters, so notice what happens when you change its shape. And be open to the possibility that the shape you started with won't be the one you end up with. As with all things, the form that you used to write the poem was a helpful tool to get you started, but that doesn't mean it's the right thing to serve your reader. So try out something different and see what sticks. Whoever said that poetry had to be printed words? We live in the 21st century and anything is possible. Well, a few things are possible. That is, we live in a world where things like audio poetry with recorded voices and sound effects is a possibility. What happens to your poem when you exercise your sound engineer skills? If you conceive of your poem not as something that someone will read, but that they'll listen to, what changes in your approach to writing it? Or what if you turn it into a cinematic poem in video form? What kinds of footage would complement your lyrical imagery in meaningful ways? What could the additional channels of audiovisual information add to your poem? How might they distract? Could you turn your poem into an image or pair it with an image? Or cut it out of old newspapers? Think of your poem not just as an idea transcribed, but as a material or digital object. It may very well end up in a traditional medium, but what might you learn about your piece if you start thinking more deliberately about the primary experience it offers to your audience? How will they interact with it, and how will that shape their perception of it? You've got all kinds of tools at your disposal, so why not get creative and free yourself from the familiarity of the printed page? Ultimately, of course, you can do whatever you want. Up to this point, I've suggested some ideas that I've seen people use or used myself, but there's no shortage of other ways you could put your poem into unusual situations to gain a new perspective on it. I once heard a poet read a poem they had written so that each line was built with sounds of the corresponding letter of the alphabet. I like to get students writing in class and then inflict randomized words on them that they have to incorporate into their work at unpredictable intervals. Don't overlook the potential that a little controlled chaos can bring to your piece. Or maybe you want to write your piece from a different point of view or as an imitation of another poem that you love. Maybe you reimagine your poem as a crossword puzzle. I don't know. There's really not a wrong way to do this. Well, there is one way to do it wrong, and that's to refuse to revise. As long as you're on board with finding ways to see your poem from a new perspective, though, you can't go wrong. The creative sky is, in fact, the limit. And with that, my friends, you've got a lot of different revision tricks you could try out. So I think the best thing to do would be to let you go and give them a shot. Thanks once again, and as always, for hanging out here with me, and I'll see you again real soon.